What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Latin American Politics. I hope that you had a fantastic extended weekend. I hope that you enjoyed Labor Day. Well, we're back together again, and we're dealing with colonialism and independence. This is the first thematic issue for the course, and it gives us an opportunity to do a whole bunch of different things. And first and foremost, we're going to set the historical and empirical context, kind of situate the colonial period and think about it in terms of where it fits into the larger picture of Latin American politics. This is an exercise in thinking about history and context in the period that the independence movement eventually came out of. It's also a chance for us to use the 5 I's. You'll recall that last time we met, we finished up with a discussion of interests, ideas, institutions, inheritance, and the international. And remember that those were like analytical perspectives that we can use to understand different components of the course. We're going to use that today for the first time in action. And what you'll see is that we'll structure our discussion of the colonial period around those different dimensions of the analysis. And so this is a chance for us to really get started and move into the more empirical territory that maybe we've been looking forward to in the course. As a reminder, I am recording the lecture, and you can view those lectures later on YouTube through the links that I provide on CAT courses. I'm also posting the slides as well. There have been questions, can I post the slides before we begin the class? I hesitate to do that because I want you to see the slides for the first time in class. And what I will do, however, is try to slow down a little bit so that maybe we could absorb more of the information with each slide. So let's try to meet in the middle, and hopefully I can satisfy the need for more context as we go along. So let's go ahead and get started. And what I want to do today as we get started is actually turn it over to you. And I want to ask you, what kind of a place was colonial Latin America? How do you understand the place, or how would you characterize colonial Latin America according to the reading that you've done, according to our understanding that we bring to the class, that you gained from thinking about this topic in preparation for class today? I want to kind of stand back for a moment, and I want to ask you to share your input and reflect on your understanding of this period of time in Latin America so that we can incorporate your feedback and then kind of set out on our discussion in a way that incorporates as many voices as possible. So I'm going to pause, and I incorporate your feedback through the chat. So let's use the chat to get involved and to engage this question.
Can you ask the question one more time, Professor?
Yeah, so I'm asking, what kind of a place was colonial Latin America? Can you characterize it for us, or can you describe it in a way that you understand it from the reading or from what you bring to the course? Ishan says, to me, colonial Latin America was the peninsulares taking over the society and telling the people that they were being liberated while taking their resources to Europe and sending millions of people across the ocean. So there's absolutely a critical role for the peninsulares in the smuggling of the resources of Latin American countries back to the colonial powers. Of course, they weren't countries or independent countries as we know them now then, but present day places like Bolivia and Peru and Mexico were absolutely plundered by colonial powers. And that's the story of much of the colonial experience. But there may be more to it than that as well. And what we'll see today is that it wasn't entirely a story of domination. It wasn't a steamroller, so to speak, in every respect. In some sense, indigenous societies did persist in important ways, and we'll see that the experience doesn't break down maybe so easily as one of domination. Quinn says, colonial Latin America was a place that became influenced by Spanish systems of institutions, from the Habsburgs to the Bourbons, and one that became a diverse continent through the mixing of Europeans and Latin America. So Quinn is pointing out that there was actually a great deal of institutional diversity within Latin American countries and across time during the colonial period. Now, again, we're talking about present day Latin American countries, but Quinn is distinguishing between the Habsburg era and the Bourbon era being sort of a reform period that saw sort of the transformation of some of the institutions that had been originally put in place during the Habsburg period. And so this diversity is important because it means that there's quite a bit of variation from place to place in terms of the kinds of systems that were set up and for what purposes. So Quinn is really onto something here. Marcella says colonization brought in new tools as well as a way of thinking. So certainly there was a role for ideas and in the modes of thought that became prevalent and that were brought in during this period as well. John says, a bunch or settlement conqueror by the conquistador spewing Christianity as the saving grace. So there was an important role for religious ideas in the form of Christianity and the desire of the Spanish Catholic Church to convert, in particular, the natives to Christianity, as well as, of course, retain the influence of the church in the new colonies among those who would leave the old world and go to the new world. Quinn says, oh, this isn't about the reading. Sorry, I was late because of my Wi-Fi. No worries, Quinn. You can reflect on the reading as well. The reading is also relevant to this discussion. So, much of what we're going to bring in will tie closely to that context. So it's fine. Sorry about the Wi-Fi. Elvis says, colonial Latin America was the quick spread of Christianity and using those institutions to mix European and Native American cultures. Okay, good. So what I'm seeing here from Elvis is that there was a role for those original indigenous societies in the institutions that they had, in the way that they organized their societies. And it was a mixing of sorts, more so than maybe a kind of steamroller effect that maybe we think of as kind of characteristic of Spanish colonialism. I really want to reiterate and stress to you that it was more nuanced than just total domination. And in fact, what we'll see is that many of the decisions and choices that the Spanish colonial power made were influenced by what they found on the ground. And this was the case for Portugal as well, but we'll focus on Spain primarily because of its heavy influence in the region. Alondra says, personally, colonial Latin America was the dominance of a superior country that was trying to spread their ideas and ideals to others because they thought their ideas and ideals were superior. So there certainly was the assumption of superiority in the effort on the part of Spain, maybe as well as Portugal, of course, to dominate and to spread their ideas and their ideals. We'll see that mercantilism and in particular Christianity and the Spanish Catholic Church were powerful proponents of ideas that went hand in hand with colonial domination. And so it is important to remember that there was an ideological basis as well as an economic basis that we'll discuss in detail as well. And so we're really getting into some important dimensions of this picture here by emphasizing ideas, also institutions, and of course, interests as well. So Christian says it was a place under stress, in a place experiencing major change. Many peoples were forced to change their entire lifestyle. A lot of cultures from the European world came in and influenced the people heavily, but not to an extent to squash every aspect of old cultures. Yeah, so there was this persistence of some of the old institutions and pre-colonial institutions, but it was also a place under stress and experiencing change, as Christian points out. The European influence was profound in the kind of bringing in of new ideas and cultures was a critical part of colonialism in Latin America. But that persistence of some of those old institutions as well is also part of the story. Samantha echoes that and agrees with this emphasis on stress and change in this mixing of cultures. Jose says colonial Latin America was a place of monarchic rule where the colonies established had to provide resources to the crowns they responded to. The uprising demand of resources was what led the Creoles and the Peninsulares to eventually reject the European crowns and fight for independence. This would allow them to maintain the resource gain for themselves without responding to an exterior rule. Interestingly enough, Jose, the Peninsulares were far less supportive of independence than the Criollos. And we'll see that the indigenous were a little more fragmented than the Criollos as well. And so the interest in independence was maybe a little narrower than it would seem. The Peninsulares largely depended on the old world and the crown for their political power and their interests. And so it would have been a disruption for them to liberate the colonies, and it was. And the main beneficiaries of that liberation were the Criollos. But you're right in pointing out that there were a range of different interests and different actors here who had potential irons in the fire, so to speak. So this is important, and we'll bring all these groups into our analysis as we go along. And the societal diversity, the social diversity is something that we'll see from the very beginning playing a role in these places. And so this is a characteristic of Latin America that we've already discussed, and we'll see that from day one, that diversity plays an important role, even if the Peninsulares were a little bit different than the Criollos. Abel says, I believe colonial Latin America was a place of innovations for Latin America from European colonials, while simultaneously an oppressive time for native people. Yes, and this is so important to remember. Even though the ending of forced labor during the Bourbon period was an improvement, natives did not enjoy equal representation or even participation in the political systems that were created through independence. And so though liberation was won and was enjoyed by parts of Latin American societies, it was not enjoyed by all parts of Latin American societies. And so we have to remember that there were tiers of experience, and indigenous people in particular were very negatively affected by colonialism and didn't benefit equally from independence either. So Marcella adds, native cultures were wiped out and forbidden. Native Americans were exploited and got their land taken away. Yes, so this is vitally important to understand. There was a very, very deliberate effort to concentrate and to uproot natives in their villages and to force labor from large groups of people. There was a sort of widespread destruction of native society in those places where institutions did not fit with the objectives of the colonizer. And these systems were very oppressive and destructive, and there's no way to sugarcoat it. And so it is important for us to remember this. Forced labor in particular was extremely destructive because it became a conduit for not just brutal repression, but also the channeling of disease from the old world that would kill scores and scores of natives who were concentrated in places where they were working and forced to labor on behalf of the crown. And so this was really destructive in a lot of different ways. And we'll see that over and over, even if we do see the persistence of some of those native institutions or systems that may have been beneficial to the colonial power. No problem, 80. Sorry about the computer. Agalith asks, colonial Latin America was central to the new trade with the height of mercantilism in Spain. Absolutely. Latin America was a source of essential and vital minerals that were critical to the production of all sorts of things. So, everything from copper and gold and silver to zinc and other kinds of minerals that would become important to the economy and the world economy. So we'll talk about that a little bit as we go along, but it is true that Latin America was central to the world economy, not just to Spain and Spain's colonial power. Marcella says, my bad, not Native Americans, I mean Native Indigenous. That's okay, Marcella. I think we knew what you meant. The natives, the indigenous pre-Columbian civilizations in Latin America, we understand them as indigenous in the same way that Native Americans in the United States are indigenous as well. So that's okay. John says, when talking about Bourbon era and the other era you are talking about. So John, you'll see that there are two periods of the colonial era. There's the sort of pre-Bourbon era and the Bourbon era. The pre-Bourbon era is associated with more absolutist policies. The Bourbon era saw some reforms that opened up markets a little bit more and eliminated some of the more oppressive policies like forced labor. You'll see that the change in those contexts and those systems became important to the eventual independence of Latin America. So these eras that we'll talk about fit into a bigger picture that forms the historical and empirical context for much of the rest of the class. And so as we set out on this discussion, I want to stress to you that though this might seem quite distant, this history that we'll discuss, you'll see time and time again that legacies of history become quite important in Latin America. So there's a long, long history, and the colonial era produced a lot of systems and institutions that tend to persist to this day. And so as we're going along, be thinking about how what we see and discuss might impact politics today and might be still with us in a variety of different ways. And so let's begin at the very start of this process that began in 1492 with the arrival of Columbus and the sort of discovery of the New World, which of course we know had been occupied and lived in by indigenous for scores and scores of centuries. But nevertheless, it was new to Europe. And for them, it was important to set up colonies or new places or new systems that could benefit them economically and politically. And so from the very start, in colonial Latin America, there were two trajectories possible, two types of colonies that could be set up based upon the different institutions the colonial powers would set up. And those were settler colonies and extractive colonies. Now, in Latin America, at the very start, European powers like Portugal and Spain and even France set up extractive states. That is, they set up authoritarian and absolutist states that were intended to solidify control and facilitate the transfer of resources away from Latin America and back to the crown. These were extractive colonies designed to set up this extractive process and strengthen and empower and enrich Spain, Portugal, and to the extent that France was involved, France as well. And so these extractive colonies carried with them a number of different interests that fell under this rubric of extractivism. And for Spain in particular, those were gold, glory, and God. And let us now begin to focus primarily on the conquest of Latin America by Spain. We'll put aside for a moment the role of Portugal because Spain is a little bit different in the experience of Latin America with Spanish colonialism is quite consistent throughout the region. Now, Spain was primarily motivated by gold, glory, and God. These were the three things that sent them to the New World. They were motivated by stories of vast empires of gold and silver, of all kinds of riches stretching from floor to ceiling. And it was true that the early conquistadores did find riches. They were quite excited to discover gold and silver in vast quantities. And very, very quickly, the major objective of the Spanish crown was to plunder those riches and send them back to Spain. Now, this was the major objective of the Spanish crown throughout this early Habsburg era, which lasted several hundred years until about the end of the colonial period when we'll get to what we call the Bourbon era. Now, during this period, this Habsburg period, the main objective was to plunder and to conquer. And this began with the stories of Hernan Cortez, who conquered the Aztecs in Mexico and discovered huge stores of gold, jewelry, and ornaments and treasures. This was very, very exciting to the Spanish crown, and it seemed to represent great potential in this new world. But it also meant that a certain kind of system would have to be set up in order to take full advantage of those riches and those vast treasures of gold and silver. We'll talk about the institutions that were set up here momentarily, but first, let's continue discussing the interests of the extractive colonies, and in particular, the Spanish. Now, there's the story of Francisco Pizarro, the conqueror of the Incas. He held the Inca leader Atahualpa ransom, and the Inca leader filled a room with gold and silver treasures worth billions today as part of what was then, in the moment, an agreement between the two to free the Inca chief. Now, Pizarro betrayed the chief, and he killed the chief anyway. This was the beginning of the end for the Incas. But this story of betrayal was also indicative of a larger pattern. And that pattern was that trickery was a part of the conquest. One of the biggest questions is, how is it that Spain conquered the natives? How is it that they were able to subdue what was essentially a gigantic population and one that was even organized into armies of their own? Well, part of it was trickery and part of it was betrayal. And part of it was the organization of Spanish armies. So, for instance, when it came to the Incas, 168 Spanish soldiers were able to defeat an Inca army of about 80,000 and an entire civilization. And how they did so didn't just involve trickery, it also involved horses, guns, and disease. And so, though the Spanish were into betrayal and willing to betray the natives, they were also willing to inflict violence upon them that the natives couldn't imagine and didn't have access to themselves in the form of horses and guns and disease. And so from the start, the Spanish are engaged in a dirty kind of activity. Obviously, extractivism doesn't carry any promises of mercy, but the Spanish were particularly brutal and particularly oppressive in the way in which they carried out uh, colonialism in the New World. And of course, principally in pursuit of gold and glory and God. And we'll discuss those here more in a moment. 80, yes, that is possible. Now, these events impressed the Spanish crown. This discovery of gold and silver treasures of vast proportions, the capacity of some conquistadores and Spanish generals to trick and betray huge numbers of natives and to ultimately conquer them and to set up extractive institutions. The Spanish crown was very early on committed to plunder as the name of the game in colonial Latin America. And they understood their interests as being closely linked to this kind of activity. But disappointingly, many areas of Latin America were actually devoid of gold and silver. And so even though the conquistadores had in mind great treasures, they often found themselves disappointed by the inconsistency of their discoveries. And so it wasn't always rainbows and sunshine for the conquistadores. And so they had to start producing other exportable things like bananas and sugar and coffee. And to do that, they also turned to indigenous labor in the same way that they turned to the indigenous to, of course, involve themselves in the extraction of those natural resources, the panning and the mining of gold and silver. On top of that, they added the exploitation of indigenous labor to produce exportable crops like bananas, sugar, and coffee. And so as the Spanish crown continually involved itself in Latin America, it became more and more involved economically in producing goods that relied on forced labor. Now, along with these economic interests that hovered around gold and silver and treasures of mineral wealth, there was also, of course, the simple reality that conquerors who returned home to Spain returned home as heroes. And this glory, the glory of conquering the new world, was a way to derive great power politically and economically inside the colonies or even back home in Spain. And it was particularly useful for lots of individuals because to conquer was a source of great pride. Spain itself was not that rich, and so it was now possible to attain unlimited wealth and achievement through activities in the New World and through the conquering of places in the New World. And so glory became an important interest along with gold and silver and all the mineral wealth that seemed to be found in present-day Latin America. Of course, there was also another interest in the form of God and the desire of the Spanish Catholic Church to convert natives to Christianity. This desire to convert natives to Christianity was a powerful idea that motivated the involvement of the church, as well as motivated cooperation between the crown and the church, who decided early on that it was beneficial for them to collaborate in pursuit of their interests. Now, the Requerimiento was the document of 1513 that was read to the Indians by the conquerors and demanded submission to the Pope and the monarchy. And this is one of the first and earliest institutions that became essential to the pursuit of those interests that are so closely linked to God, glory. Now, the Requerimiento was a method of ensuring dominance over local populations. This was essentially a way of guaranteeing control of indigenous people. Subjects were asked to acknowledge the church and the Pope as the ruler and superior of the whole world. And since the Pope legitimized the crown and its conquests, this was basically a way of solidifying political authority of the crown in the New World. And so this fusion or this link between the crown and the church in the way in which the crown legitimized the church meant that any solidification of control would involve religious ideals, and in this case, the requerimiento, ensuring dominance through the acceptance of this code, so to speak. Now, this code or this pledge, it was really quite a trick, and we've already seen that trickery was a part of the conquest, but it was a trick in the sense that if the pledge was taken, Indians would be free of servitude and they would not be forced to convert. It was their choice. But the price for refusing was quite great. And the price of refusing was the enslavement of the subject and their children. And so it's quite a catch-22. You don't actually have a choice. You have a choice to be free of servitude by accepting the pledge and handing over your religiosity, in essence. But if you don't, you are enslaved, as are your children. And what this did, in addition to, of course, enslaving indigenous and taking away their human freedom, was it absolved the conquerors themselves of their sins. And it's what it meant then is it meant that any deaths resulting from refusal to accept Christian teachings were the fault of the indigenous themselves. And of course, this is outrageous, and this is something that's beyond the pale, but it was a way for the Spanish to establish control and to solidify control in a way that relied on the power of the church as well as the power of the crown. Yes, 80, crown means monarchy. So when we say crown, we mean the Spanish monarchy. This is a representation of the requerimiento. It was one of the first interactions between conquerors and indigenous. The pledge was read to them and they were given the choice, air quotes, of accepting or negating the pledge. And of course, what would follow was their freedom or their enslavement, depending upon which they chose. But the requerimiento was an important component of solidifying control by the crown as well as the church, and it relied, of course, on the fusion of the authority of both. And it was quite brutal and oppressive in the way that it was implemented. Now, these different interests, God, glory, and God, gold, glory, and God, were not mutually exclusive. In fact, they sometimes conflicted. And this is where Spanish colonialism begins to become more complicated. And we begin to see some of the internal contradictions of Spanish colonialism and some of the problems inherent in the model. And eventually we'll see that some of these conflicts created tensions that could not be surmounted and eventually would weaken the colonial presence and make it easier for independence movements to succeed. But for now, let's pull back and focus on some of these conflicts. The name of the game in politics is often interests, and it's the conflict of interest that drives politics forward. During this period, it was no exception. The Spanish crown, for example, wanted to consolidate its power, and it feared the conquerors would give rise to a new nobility in the New World. The idea was, though the crown was the ultimate authority, there was too much distance between the conquerors on the ground and the crown itself to properly ensure the domination of the Spanish crown. Was it possible for the conquerors to become a new nobility in the New World? It absolutely was possible. And it was possible if the conquerors could claim sovereignty over the Indians. This was what happened in feudal Europe, after all, where it was possible for conquerors to claim sovereignty over peasants. This was a situation that was rife for exploitation by the conquerors themselves, and it was a situation that made the crown quite vulnerable because the crown depended on the conquerors, but also relied on the subordination of the conquerors to the crown. So the crown had a challenge, and that challenge was, how do we reward conquerors and yet prevent them from becoming a new nobility? Well, to do that, they set up institutions that were designed to limit the power of those conquerors and solidify the control of the crown back home. in those institutions are what we'll discuss now. Just for clarification, Indians refers to the natives in this case. Yes, so when we say Indians, we're referring to the natives in present-day Latin America. So the indigenous, the pre-Columbian civilizations, those ancient civilizations that we discussed early on in the course. And so to resolve this conflict of interests, the Crown sets up institutions that are designed to limit the powers of the conquerors and solidify the control of the Crown. Let's discuss some of those institutions. First, there was the encomienda, and this comes from the Spanish word encomendar, which is a verb for to entrust. Now, the encomienda gave Spaniards trusteeship over indigenous laborers in a given area. Now, these were usually small geographical areas that were very well defined, and the idea was give Spaniards from the old world control over Indians working in that area, entrust them to control the Indians in that area. Now, here was the key. The Spaniards did not own the Indians legally, or the encomiendas, which were the sort of properties or estates, if you will. These belonged to the king, and Indians were actually subjects of the crown. So this was different from fiefdoms in feudal Europe, where peasants were subjects of the nobility, not of the crown. And so right away, Latin America, the Spanish crown designs institutionally to work differently than feudal Europe, precisely so that the Spanish crown can maintain that authority. Now, it was also the case that landowners were prohibited from living in those Indian villages, and there was also no inheritance. Upon the death of the encomendero, or the individual who had the encomienda, it all reverted back to the crown. So all of these rules and these sets of institutions were designed to keep the encomienda from becoming an estate as in old Europe. Again, the idea was, how do we allow for the kind of creation of a nobility and a conqueror class without losing power to that class? How can we rely on that class to control forced labor without that class becoming too powerful and capable of establishing control of the Indians themselves? The encomienda was an example, an early example, and one of the most important ways of establishing this control on the behalf of the Spanish crown. So this is what the encomienda looked like. Remember that the encomendero, the individual who kept the encomienda, was not allowed to live in the Indian villages, and also could not control or maintain control of that property. It was legally, technically, it was owned by the crown, right? So the encomendero is basically just like a tenant, just kind of like a manager in charge of these assets that legally belong to the crown, in that are designed to be at arm's length from the encomendero. Alondra asks, in the reading, it spoke of the king offering land to those that went to the New World to spread their ideals. Is this what it meant? Or like borrowed property until death? Absolutely. So there was this fusion between the desire to convert natives to Christianity and to establish control of economic assets to create and siphon wealth. It was often the case that the crown would reward those who were interested in promoting those ideals because of collaboration between the church and the crown. And so, yes, those were often fused, and there was a link between the two. Leonardo says, so why would a Spaniard want to be a part of this? They own nothing then. Well, good question. It has to do with the political power and the influence that they can still retain in these relationships. Even if they don't own anything, it's still more influence within the system than if they had no role whatsoever. And so these institutions still create responsibilities that gave them an important benefit or an important role in a society that they might not have had. So there still was an interest, there still was a benefit. And you'll see here in a moment that they still benefited in ways that they weren't intended to, but that were quite lucrative. Is this the power a two-way street? I'm not sure what you mean, John. Like a loophole or so. Yeah, so there were some loopholes that we'll discuss here in a while. And what I'll tell you for now is that the encomenderos and the various conquerors had a wide array of ways of exploiting the Indians and benefiting from their control of the Indians. And so, although it may not be obvious, these systems were prone to a lot of uh, exploitation. And it wasn't just that they were forcing the labor of the indigenous, it was also that they would take advantage of their control of them to advance credit and to often entrap them in economic situations that would leave them indebted to the conquerors. And so you'll see here momentarily that these institutions and these systems helped these various interest groups and these various actors in a variety of ways. So let's discuss some of these institutions further. Indians would work in their villages, but conquistadores could exploit the Indian labor for their own economic gain and get rich. And they could do this in a variety of ways. They could advance them credit, and the Indians would in turn become indebted to them. They could sell them goods that the Indians didn't necessarily need, but that they might be able to require the Indians to purchase. And they can entrap them in economic relations of dependence that would be bad for the Indians. And the, the deal was that the Indians would give their labor and the encomenderos would offer protection. And this relationship, this exchange relationship, if you will, wasn't really an exchange relationship because the Indians didn't have freedom of movement and were in fact enslaved in effect. And we'll talk about that in a moment, even though it wasn't necessarily direct slavery. We'll discuss that in a second. The deal was the Indians would give their labor and the encomenderos would offer protection. Meanwhile, the church would teach the Indians and it would convert them to Christianity. And this meant that the church and the crown were collaborating and working together closely from the very beginning. And domination took the form of both political as well as religious control. And these relationships all tended to lend themselves to this kind of collaboration and this joint promotion of the church and the state's objectives. What about viceroys? Jose, we'll get to that here in a moment. Viceroys were very important. It was another institution that helps us to understand the colonial experience, but we'll get there in a second. Now, what was the role of the church precisely? And what did they do to kind of help promote this system? Now, the church salaries were paid by the crown. And in exchange, the crown had the right to appoint priests, bishops, and ecclesiastic officials. The church would permit the crown to make these appointments. It would cooperate with the crown in the design of the leadership of the church in a way that was helpful to the crown and the interests of the crown. The crown also used tributes paid by the natives to cover church salaries and other expenses in return for the church, again, collaborating with and promoting the interests of the crown. And in 1574, the Spanish crown actually decreed the Ordenanza del Patronazgo, which increased the control of the crown over the church, principally by allowing the crown to insert itself between the papacy and the church, and decreeing that all tithes would be turned over to the crown. And so what you see here is that it wasn't necessarily a mutually beneficial relationship for the church and the crown. Certainly the church benefited from the spread of Christianity, but the crown exerted increasing control over the church itself. And so the church as an organization increasingly became a weapon and a tool of colonial control. And this, of course, being represented by the crown taking control and inserting itself in the line of organization within the organization, and then decreeing that all tithes would be turned over to the crown. And so this was an important set of institutions as well, because it meant that the church increasingly became a tool of central control, even though originally it was somewhat autonomous or at least independent compared to where we are now. Now, in terms of the church, what about the various ecclesiastic officials in the church itself? Did they also own indigenous labor? Did they also own forced indigenous labor? They did. And in fact, there are stories of various priests and leaders within the church who even dissented. although there were very, very few of them early on. One exception was Bartolome de las Casas. He was a priest and an owner of indigenous labor himself who saw abuses and renounced them. And he recognized from the very beginning that encomiendas were not good for Indians. And precisely because they subjected the Indians to such harsh working conditions. And they raised the question of whether the encomiendas were an example of trusteeship or slavery. And the line was very, very thin. And Bartolome de las Casas argued that that line was frequently crossed, and in fact, that the Indians were in conditions that were much closer to slavery than trusteeship. De las Casas said that the church was supposed to care for the Indians, and he protested that they weren't focusing primarily on converting them to Christianity, and that they were instead becoming involved with the crown in the exploitation of forced labor. De las Casas was unique in this regard. He was the first voice of dissent, although there would be others. But De las Casas was important because he put in perspective precisely how the encomiendas affected the indigenous. And he was the first one to admit to the abuses that took place within the system in the way in which the system bordered on slavery. Now, De las Casas wrote this book, a short account of the destruction of the Indies, that we still read today as the first time a European admitted to slavery and abuses. And this book tells the story of what De las Casas himself, an indigenous labor owner, witnessed and what he opposed as a priest and as one who believed that the church's objective should have been to focus on converting natives to Christianity instead of forcing them into labor. And he actually went further than just writing a book. He even lobbied the crown for reforms and was able to get the crown to pass the new laws of 1542, which abolished slavery. And what this meant was that Indians could not be forced to work. They could be forced to pay tribute, but not forced to work. Now, we know that the system was always a system of slavery, and it very carefully concealed the true reality by pretending that Indians had a choice. Now, encomiendas did not represent much of a choice. It was essentially slavery. The crown passed laws to abolish what they agreed was essentially slavery. Now, unfortunately, old habits die hard, and the encomenderos, those conquerors that we just discussed, retaliated, and many of the abuses continued. It was just asked a moment ago, what was in it for a Spaniard or a conqueror to become an encomendero if they didn't have any ownership or control of the labor itself? Well, what they had was a set of benefits that they derived from their control of economic relationships with Indians, those relationships of indebtedness that I discussed, those other economic relationships, those market relationships. For these reasons, the encomenderos lashed out when the crown tried to change the rules and abolish what was effectively slavery. And in effect, many of the abuses continued. This did highlight the limited control of the crown. It also highlighted the strength of the conquerors and the Spaniards in the New World who had become encomenderos and who controlled these encomiendas. And what we see then are these interest groups inside these institutions kind of in conflict over the shape of the institutions in the direction of policy in the colony. I'm going to pause and take a look at the chat. Who were the recommenderos protecting the Indians from? Weren't the recommenderos the dangerous ones? So, Marcela, the encomenderos were the dangerous ones in the sense that they were taking advantage of the labor, but at least technically, or in terms of the way it was supposed to work, they were supposed to be able to provide them with the necessities that they otherwise would not get. And they were supposed to protect them and take care of them in a way that they might not otherwise, or that they assumed that they would not be taken care of otherwise. But this often involved uprooting villages, and it often meant providing them with less support than they maybe would have had if they had just been left to their own devices. And so obviously they were not necessarily protecting these Indians. It was more likely that they were taking advantage of them and entrapping them in very difficult circumstances. Now, this entire system of interests in institutions that we've discussed, it wasn't just based on no idea at all. There was supposed to be a logic to this madness. There was supposed to be a sort of ideological foundation for this system of exploitative, extractive institutions. And the ideological basis for these systems was mercantilism. And mercantilism is basically an economic theory that emphasizes developing trade between a colonizer and its colonies. And the idea is that you arrange institutions to promote rapid wealth acquisition based on the accumulation of precious resources. So, in other words, you set up systems to siphon natural resource wealth from a colony to a colonial power, in this case, Spain. And the point is to prevent competition from other colonizing states. All the action is supposed to take place between Spain and Latin America. This is supposed to purely benefit Spain at the expense of Latin America and at the expense of everyone else. What was the justification or the motivation for this idea? Well, Spain needed to assure a steady pool of labor for its production of exportable food and minerals back home. And so it became very important to kind of establish a hold and kind of corner the market, so to speak, and take as much as they could get from those colonies to support the objectives of the crown in pursuit of its economic policy. And so mercantilism was quite destructive, and it was extremely exploitative, and it depended on taking advantage of labor and forcing labor and putting in place institutions that would facilitate the extraction of wealth and sending it back home to Spain. And so those institutions, those extractive institutions, are mercantilist institutions. And those mercantilist institutions promote economic self-sufficiency and consumption. The whole idea is send all the gold, all the silver back to Spain. We want to be self-sufficient and rely on the mineral wealth that we can get from the Latin American colonies and consume back home. And this system involved restrictions on trade and ownership and participation. No other colonizing powers can do trade with Latin America. All the action was between Latin America and Spain. And within those colonies themselves, there was the promotion of a status group hierarchy. That is a sort of set of classes, kind of like a caste system. And moreover, there's a patrimonial state economic elite that's closely linked to the old world. And that state economic elite are like encomenderos and the various conquistadores who were connected to the crown and who were involved in controlling exploited labor in Indian villages. And so these mercantilist institutions supported this idea or this approach, this extractive approach, this mercantilist approach that focused on isolating economic activity between the colonies and between Spain. And these institutions stood in contrast to liberal institutions, which we'll discuss later on in this lecture, and that were very, very different, and that were primarily put in place outside of Latin America in places like the present-day United States and Canada, New Zealand, etc. So these mercantilist institutions cohered to this notion, this idea of mercantilism. And before we continue, there's an important note that we've got to take here, which is the relationship between social complexity and mercantilist colonialism. Now, it's often said that Spain was like a steamroller that destroyed everything in its path in colonial Latin America. But that's actually not true at all. And in fact, what you'll find if you look at the data is that Spain colonized those areas of Latin America that were already the most developed. So it colonized most heavily where pre-colonial institutions, indigenous society was already the most developed. How could that be? Why is it that they took advantage of places that were already the most developed? Wouldn't that be difficult to steamroll and destroy and build back up again? It would be. And the truth is that that's not what they did. They exploited those existing institutions. They colonized those areas most heavily because they took advantage of the systems that already existed and that were already in place. And overall, those systems were systems that already facilitated forced labor. So many indigenous societies, pre-Columbian societies that were the most developed, already had slavery, already had some form of forced labor, and already had systems that the Spanish could take advantage of and exploit for their own purposes. And so this is why you see a very close relationship between the level of pre-colonial development, that is the level of development of the indigenous society, in the level of colonialism by Spain. And so take a look. What you'll notice is that where pre-colonial development was low, Spain engaged in very limited colonialism. Where it was high, as in Bolivia, they engaged in very extensive colonialism. Again, Chile, low pre-colonial development, low colonialism. Go down to Ecuador, high pre-colonial development, high indigenous development, high level of colonialism. Time and time again, you'll notice a link between the level of indigenous development and the level of colonialism. And that's because as a mercantilist power, Spain was exploiting already existing institutions, and specifically the stratification in those indigenous societies that permitted them to enslave labor for the purpose of exporting wealth back to Spain. I'm going to take a look at the chat right now. Was the necessity actually price tagged in entrapping them to services? So John, yes. So the Repartimiento de Mercados and other systems were designed to entrap them in economic relationships that we're not discussing a lot right here, but there were various benefits that encomenderos gained from these situations that were essentially corrupt and that were self-serving. And so we'll get to that in a little bit, but yeah, you're essentially correct. 80 asked, mercantilism was based on the idea that a nation's wealth and power were best served by increasing exports, and so involved increasing trade, and they would not trade with other countries, right? That's right, 80. That's what we've kind of covered here. You're exactly right. That's what Spain did too during the Habsburg period. And so the idea was all the action was going to be between Spain and Latin America. All other colonial powers were left out in the reign. And the idea was this would exclusively benefit colonial powers, in this case Spain, but other colonial powers used mercantilism too to also establish those very, very exclusive relationships with their colonies. Now, mercantilism was a very destructive ideology because this idea also gave rise to labor shortages. The whole idea that you could force Indians into labor and that you could take advantage of pre-existing stratification to enslave workers meant that eventually there would be labor shortages, and that disease in particular brought by the Europeans would ravage the Indian population and affect the pool of available labor. Smallpox in particular was really, really destructive. And so this emphasis on labor and forced labor meant that Indian populations would also be subjected to all the ravages of European colonization. And the biggest killer of the indigenous was ultimately disease. As destructive as the Europeans were in the form of the violence and the oppression and the forced labor, the indigenous were most destroyed by disease. And it was disease in the form of smallpox and others that would ultimately give rise to not just the destruction of the indigenous, but the importation of African slaves. And so these various processes are connected. And so take a look at these numbers. The Mexican population in 1519 was 25 million. In 1568, it was 2.65 million. And in 1605, it was 1 million. That's a decline of 95% in less than a year, in less than 100 years, excuse me. It's been a long day. It's an enormous decline, and it testifies to the enormous destruction carried out by disease, like smallpox and others. Peru's population also fell from 9 million in 1532 to about 1.3 million in 1570. And the increase in imported slaves also testifies to this pattern of disease and destruction. So between 1518 and 1870, 1.5 million African slaves were imported into Spanish America. Brazil, which was ruled by Portugal, imported a whopping 3.7 million slaves. And so this was closely linked to the destruction of the indigenous by disease brought by Europeans and compounded by the way in which Indians were often concentrated together as part of the system set up to force them into labor. And so the idea of mercantilism also meant that Indians would be very badly affected by disease and other things that would arise out of the economic relationships that were set up by the mercantilist system. Of course, Indians were also subject to labor control systems. And these labor control systems were vitally important for the Spanish because it was their way of exerting control over the indigenous in taking advantage of their labor. I'm going to take a look at the chat really quickly here. From what I am understanding is that Native Americans were already exploiting each other before Spain even arrived, and that this made it easier for Spain to exploit the natives since they were already used to such systems. That's right, Leonardo. As I said a moment ago, we see that Spain colonized areas most heavily when those areas had forced labor already in slavery within the indigenous society. And those indigenous societies that were the most complex had social stratification systems in slavery already. And so that's why mercantilist colonialism was most extensive in areas that were the most developed. And so you're exactly right, Leonardo. It's true that slavery did exist already, and that was an institution that was taken advantage of by the mercantilist powers like Portugal and Spain. Jose says, yes, natives would constantly war among each other for territorial supremacy, and they would take prisoners alongside resources and tributes. This is true. There were tensions among those groups as well. And so there was a lot of fragmentation among natives and indigenous groups. And this is what made it possible for the Spanish to defeat them and conquer them, because they were so fragmented and because there was so little coordination between them. So as we return to this discussion of forced labor and the institutions that were set up to facilitate this mercantilist colonial project, we've got to discuss the repartimiento. This is a method of forcing Indian villages to offer up a portion of their population, 2 to 4%, to work. And what this involved was uprooting villagers and forcing them into settlements. Indians were forced to work on farms, they were forced to work in mines, and they were forced to do so for months on end. And this was different than encomiendas. Encomiendas did not involve uprooting Indians. The repartimiento, however, did, and this involved the massive uplifting and moving of Indians in the sort of cordoning of mass labor and destroying traditional village life. And so this is in some ways comparable to the ultimate result of the Trail of Tears in the United States. Of course, the Trail of Tears involved uprooting natives and transporting them in consolidating or concentrating them in camps or interning them in a way that would be more useful to the powers that be. In this case, the repartimiento was similar in that it resulted in the uprooting of villages, in the concentration of Indian labor, and the destruction of village life. So to give you just a sense of how this worked and what it looked like in Bolivia, 900 villages were converted into a mere 44 settlements. And Bolivia was a place where the pre-colonial institutional complexity was the greatest of almost any place in Latin America. This is a place where the pre-Columbian society was very, very sophisticated, and consequently, the Spanish, in pursuit of their mercantilist project, most extensively converted those villages into settlements in Bolivia. Bolivia saw the most extensive conversions into settlements precisely because of its sophistication and its complexity and the pre-existence of social stratification systems that could be taken advantage of by the Spanish. And so labor control in the form of the repartimiento was another important institution. It was different than the encomiendas. It was more brutal than the encomiendas, but it was part of the same set of processes designed to facilitate this mercantilist project. Now, these labor control systems in the form of the repartimiento were controlled by officials that we refer to as corregidores. These were government officials who had control over a well-defined Indian population for purposes of exploiting their labor for the repartimiento. These were basically managers of forced labor. They could own land, they could use labor, they could demand the payment of tributes, And in general, they had very tight control over those who worked under them and answered to them. And what was interesting is that these positions were sold by the crown and they were good for only 2 years. There was an incentive to exploit the Indian population to the absolute max and to earn quick profits before losing the position, precisely because of how quickly they were turned over. Now, why is it that Spain only allowed these to exist for 2 years? Well, it's because they wanted to, again, prevent the rise of a landed elite, a nobility, right? A group of conquerors who could subject the indigenous population to their control. Allowing these positions to exist for only 2 years meant that just as soon as officials got comfortable, the crown could rip the rug out from under them and take their power away. And so, even though that meant that the Spanish crown was in a position of power relative to the corregidores, it also meant that the corregidores had the incentive, faced the incentive to exploit the population and take advantage of them in every single way that they could. And so the corregidores, in some ways, like the encomenderos, were able to take advantage of those relationships. And the corregidores were able to take advantage of them in ways that even the encomenderos could not. So the corregidores, because they had more control over the Indians, they were especially able to advance credit to them as so as to entrap them in relations of indebtedness. They were able to control their economic relationships, and they were able to sell them goods that they did not need. And they were able to do so at a far greater rate than were the encomenderos. And so the corregidores had more power, but they were set up from the start to be limited in their power and limited in the duration of their power. The corregidores were practically paid in mayors, says Jose, or says John, excuse me. Now, it was previously mentioned that there was an important role for viceroys, and there was an important role for viceroys. Political institutions set up by the crown, the Spanish crown, took a variety of forms, but the main objective, again, was to exert control for a long way off, from a long way off. And this was the principal challenge. Spain is far away from the New World. How is it that Spain exerts control and establishes control in this space that's so far away? The solution, they determined, was to create viceroys. These are basically vice kings, and they rule over viceroyalties, or these vast areas of the New World or of the colony, in service to the king. They take the place of the king. They do not replace the king. The king is ultimately in charge. The viceroys answer to the king, but the viceroys themselves are vice kings. And this was a way to set up systems that would preserve central control and would hopefully prevent the rise of a landed nobility and a set of conquistadores and conquerors that could take control and eventually declare independence from Spain. So yet again, we see Spain responding to that same challenge of exerting central control from a far off distance and doing so in a way that prevents the rise of a landed elite or a nobility that can challenge that central control. Now, these viceroys, they lived in splendor. As I'm sure you can imagine, they had palaces and servants, and to the nines. They enjoyed all of the furnishings, all of the great benefits of being in control and being linked to the king. But the crown was also worried that they would assume too much power. And so, yet again, we see the design of institutions intended to restrain the power and the influence of these local elites. So the crown set term limits for the viceroys. Those term limits were 3 years, and the viceroy served at the pleasure of the king, who could remove those viceroys on a whim, even before those 3 years were up. And the crown, moreover, chose to divide and conquer. They split viceroyalties into administrative and judicial power. So judicial power was in the hands of the audiencias. These were panels of 9 judges There was no set term, and they had the power to launch inquiries into viceroy behavior. On the other hand, the administrative power was in the hands of the viceroys. Those audiencias stood in contrast to the viceroys. And the whole point was to create obstacles to the exercise or the expression of unbridled power and to limit the influence of those viceroys. And to that end, it was also the case that the crown set up visiting generals. These were basically military men who were sent to check up on the viceroys. Captain generals were another category of military men who had control over certain areas and were supposed to represent another layer of sort of obstacle or check and balance institutions, if you will. The whole point was to create a set of systems that would connect those in control in the New World to the crown, but would keep those in control in the New World from gaining power of their own sufficient to declare independence. And so yet again, we see that institutions are set up to try to resolve challenges, political challenges of influence and power for the colony. Adi, I think that your connection might not be the best because I haven't heard from anyone else that they have similar issues. Leonardo asks, is our presidential system inspired by Spain's precaution of too much power? Not quite, Leonardo. So I can't really say what the precise influence of Spain's situation on our system is, but that's a question that we can maybe return to. I'm not going to comment on it because I don't think I know enough to really say, frankly. But returning to this question of the viceroys, I want to emphasize again the way in which these institutions were set up to restrain this new set of conquerors, and the way that these systems were set up to prevent the rise of a new elite that could challenge the crown. There were more institutions set up to this effect that we'll talk about, and those included the fuero militar. This meant the military jurisdiction. Military courts were given wider jurisdiction. The whole point was to set up a set of security forces that could preserve the influence of the crown and could kind of restrain expressions of power by some of those local elites. And these military men who benefited from the fuero militar, they were not accountable for civil or criminal transgressions. They were immune from regular courts, and this was decreed in 1769. And this came at a time when there was a need for Spain to sort of monopolize and use military power and use militaries to restrain local elites and to ensure the dominance of the crown. But as we'll see later in the course, the creation of the fuero militar was very consequential for Latin America today, because today, one legacy of the fuero militar is that human rights cases sometimes grant immunity to military men who have been prosecuted for human rights abuses committed either in the course of maybe domestic counterinsurgency efforts or something else along those lines. But what I want to emphasize to you is that this is yet another institution set up to prevent the rise of that local elite that could challenge the central control of the crown. The fuero militar, however, would be very consequential for politics going forward, and we'll see that in the class time and time again when we discuss the role of the military in politics. So here is the fuero militar. What you see is this representation of the kind of immunity granted to the military men and the actors who were involved in using violence to preserve the influence and the power of the crown. And this is just another way to think about the situation and about the institution and the way that it worked in practice to preserve central control. Now, as before, there were a lot of conflicts between these various institutions. In the same way that there were conflicts of interests between different interest groups, there were conflicts between different institutions, and primarily around the relationships between the church, conquerors, landowners, and the crown. And so the missionaries, the Catholic Church, they would congregate Indians in ecclesiastical communities, and their goal was to exert control over them so as to convert them and turn them into Christians. But hacienda owners and encomenderos and corregidores wanted the Indian labor. And so they had an interest that really was in conflict with the interest of the missionaries who wanted to convert them. The crown, moreover, wanted to prevent both the church and the hacienda owners, the encomenderos, the corregidores, from gaining too much power. All of these different actors wanted to watch over the other, and they could report up the chain of command because of the way in which dividing and conquering had been used to separate and sort of parcel out power and influence among different institutions. Now, this system worked beautifully for hundreds of years to maintain Spanish control over the region. It meant that the Spanish crown could rely on a kind of division of influence and division of powers to hold up a system that principally benefited the Spanish crown, but that also created benefits for a whole set of actors who were part of the system as well. The conquistadores, the encomenderos, the corregidores, ecclesiastical officials and church officials. All of these actors benefited from the system, and they all checked and balanced each other. And in doing so, they contributed to the kind of persistence of this colonial project for hundreds and hundreds of years. And I want to pause here and emphasize this irony. We have the persistence of a colonial project based on the conflicts that had been deliberately created between the various components of the system. The various social actors are in deliberate conflict with one another, and they're intentionally in conflict. It was intended that way. But this set of conflicts is what helps to preserve the system, because it creates a set of relationships among power brokers that contributes to what we call an equilibrium, or a situation where no actor has an incentive to change their position, and where all actors might have conflicts with each other, but are able to kind of counteract each other in a way that contributes to a lot of stability. Of course, all good things must come to an end. And of course, we know that colonialism was not good for indigenous people in Latin America, even if it was good for Spain and for the Spanish crown. And when we say that all things must come to an end, what we're talking about is the gradual lead up to independence. And this is when things in Latin America begin to really change. And when the Spanish crown's influence and power and control and authority begin to break down. And the actors in this story, in this episode, are the same actors that we've discussed from the beginning. We've got Peninsulares, we've got Criollos, we've got different interests, different groups with different relationships to the economy and each other, fighting it out and in conflict over the shape and the fate of Latin America in present-day Latin America. Well, we don't have much time. We've got 2 minutes left here, and what I'm going to do is say a little bit more about this lead up to independence, but we will probably have to complete the lecture on Monday of next week. Actually, you know what, everyone? I think I'm going to pause right here and take questions if you've got questions, or contributions if you've got contributions. If you do not, you're free to go. I'm going to stop the recording and we can finish this lecture on Monday. I'm going to send you the updated syllabus before this week is over, but for Monday, you'll read Centeno, which is the next assigned reading on the course schedule. Does anyone have any questions or comments as you all prepare to depart?